Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christoph, for this kind introduction. I am very happy to be here, and Monica kindly invited me to the Leipzig University 2009, then 2011, and 11 years later, I am very happy to be here. And this is really the group I want to engage with for many years, since I also study secularism. I want to start with remembering those who suffer in Turkey in the earthquake, and including some of my family members. I also want to mention that I'm very happy to be with my friend Hüsamettin Derviş, one of the scholars who study Islam and secularism in an in-depth manner. And we had a nice dinner yesterday night and learned about the program. So my intellectual evolution or transformation start with Secularism, the first book. Then it leads me to analyze the historical roots of certain problems in Muslim majority countries. And today I want to start with the opposite chronological background. Rather than starting today, secular state leading to Islamic history, I want to start with Islamic history first, then lead you to today, what's happening. Because one question brings the another. One dependent variable turned into an independent variable in this analysis. When we look at the Muslim world today, out of 50 Muslim majority countries, we only have very few democracies. They are shrinking, the group is shrinking. I wrote a report 2 years ago saying that there are 8 Muslim majority democracies. Then we just lost Burkina Faso after the coup we were just discussing. And then in Tunisia, of course, we lost again. And when we look at the problem of socioeconomic underdevelopment, authoritarianism, and political violence, they really seem to establish a vicious circle. And this present vicious circle is becoming more and more interesting when we know about the early Muslim history. That's what I want to start with. Because in the early Muslim history, between 8th and 12th centuries, Muslims produced not only cutting-edge philosophers and polymaths, but also important bourgeoisie class at a time when Europe didn't have either intellectually vibrant or economically productive class. Then the point I disagree with those who established the decline literature is that the supremacy of the West and the decline of the Muslim world didn't start overnight. Instead, as you see in this table, there was about 500 years of comparable level of development between the two regions. Then after the 16th, 17th centuries, European Western supremacy began in terms of science and economy and some other grounds. So I try to analyze in details in my new Islam book what I mean by scientific supremacy, what the contributions of Muslim polymaths were, including Khwarizmi developing algebra algorithms and certain mathematical formula and Arabic numerals that we know today, though they learned from India originally. Then Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, political theorism, Ibn Sina important medical doctors, Al-Haytham produced the prototype of original camera, so on and so forth. Also, in terms of economic innovations and institutions, Muslims developed what we know today, Czech, and certain financial institutions. And they had libraries, cities, and very dynamic socioeconomic life. Then came certain stagnation. Meanwhile, Europe had the rise. And then until today, we keep discussing what is development, what is underdevelopment, and what are the reasons. Basically, in my new Islam book, I challenge two established notions. One is blaming Islam. We call them essentialist, orientalist, or Islamophobe. And the other is blaming Western imperialism and colonization. We call them anti-colonial or post-colonial approach. Criticizing both, I'm arguing that it's all about class relations. And the argument is not about the Muslim world per se. The argument is tried to be universal, at least covering both the Muslim world and Europe. And then look at the relationship between political class, intellectual class, economic class, and religious class. If these four classes have certain level of autonomy and separation to some extent, then you have a productive economic and scholarly life. And Muslims had it until the mid-11th century. They had independent scholars, independent merchant class supporting each other. At the time, Europe didn't have this too, therefore Europe was not dynamic. But after the 11th century, we have the reversal. Europe started to have bourgeoisie class in Italian city-states, then the Dutch, then the British. Meanwhile, this bourgeoisie class was in engagement with an intellectual class with the opening of universities. There are so many complex factors, such as the Gregorian reform of the 11th century, which helped the institutionalization of the church-state through the separation in Europe, whereas the Muslim world took the opposite path. And therefore, this Muslim golden age, before 11th and 12th centuries, had a very different characteristics of what many Muslims imagine today. Because you know, the debate started with Ernest Renan. And when Ernest Renan made the famous or infamous speech about Islam and science, he said that the so-called Muslim golden age had nothing to do with Islam or Muslims. It's all about Greeks, Persians, and others. And in my book, I tried to really engage with this argument, showing that no, there were Muslims, Arabs, and Islam on many aspects contribute to this golden age. But at the same time, today's Islamist argument that it was all about piety. If we go back to Islamic piety, we'll have progress again. That's also completely wrong, because it wasn't all about piety as they understand, as orthodoxy. Instead, it was a time of diversity, coexistence of Sunni Muslims, and there was no such thing as Sunni Muslims until the 11th century. There was Asharis, Shafis, Hanbali, Maliki, Hanafi, and others, and Ismaili Shia and other Shias, and agnostics, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians. And this heterogeneous society, learning from both Greek, Persian, also Indian and Chinese, they establish a very dynamic civilization. That's the beauty and important secret ingredient of Muslim golden age as defined. But another important dimension is that when I mean independent scholars, I not only refer to philosophers like Khwarizmi, Razi, Ibn Haytham, Farabi, Ibn Sina, Biruni, but also Islamic scholars like Abu Hanifa. Because these Islamic scholars were both bourgeoisie, funded by trade, commerce, either themselves or their families, and also studying Islamic sciences. And we have Cohen data of 1970 between 8th and mid-11th centuries, when he analyzed 3,900 Muslim scholars, realized that only 9% were state servants, receiving money like qadi, becoming judge, or other servant positions in the state. 91% were privately funded. A very large spectrum of jobs, mostly related to commerce. And this connection between trade and Islamic sciences create a certain level of separation. Though many people, both anti-Islamic and pro-Islamic camps, argue that there is no separation in Islam. There was 400 or 500 years of certain level of separation. And that wasn't something people were not aware of. No, they were very conscious about it and took it preciously. For example, when Abu Hanifa, the first major founder of Fiqh school, was proposed to be Qadi by an Abbasi caliph, he rejected. And then the anecdote goes on that the caliph, the leader, asked a reason for the rejection. Abu Hanifa said, I'm not qualified to be the judge. That makes the caliph outraged, and he says, no, you are the most qualified, you are lying to me. Then Abu Hanifa said, a liar can never be a judge. If I am a liar, I cannot be. Then it makes the leader angry. Abu Hanifa was put in jail, poisoned to death. And Ahmed bin Hanbal was a textile merchant. He wasn't like a pious bourgeoisie like Abu Hanifa, but still insists on his independence. Maliki was beaten, Shafi was arrested, and Shia leaders, Jafar, they were some killed, and always put a distance between themselves and the state. That was a principal distance. But then came change. I only have a few minutes to summarize, but basically the 11th century transformation was multidimensional, similar to 11th, 12th century transformation in Europe, that had economic basis because of the decline of fertility of Iraqi fields. The budget of the treasury of Abbasis, then Buyuts, then the Seljuks didn't have enough cash to pay the salary of civilian and military servants. Therefore, they started to distribute lands, which called the Iqta system of land revenue distribution, a semi-feudal system, replaced the old market economy, money-based economy. And together with this economic transformation, there was the political change, nomadic Turks coming from Central Asia, bringing a more military understanding of state, conquest, fetih-based understanding. And then this militarization of state and politicization of economy marginalized landowners and merchants. Then they created a financial vacuum who would fund the scholars. And the Grand Vizier, the Prime Minister of the Seljuk Empire, Nizam al-Mulk, came and built established institutions, madrasas, funded indirectly by the state. And this was a turning point. After that, until today, madrasas and schools, mostly connected to state power, produce a particular version of ulema, Islamic scholars, who are prone to be state servant or partners of the state and government. And the ulema-state alliance emerged. And there was no religious basis, therefore, they fabricated a hadith. Religion and state are twins. Religion is the foundation, state is the guardian. That without foundation collapses, that without the guardian perishes. That's a Sasani maxim, 300 years before Prophet Muhammad, it was said as a proverb. But many Muslim scholars, in order to justify the ulema-state alliance, fabricated this as the hadith of the Prophet. And there was nothing in the Quran about this. Therefore, they reinterpret a verse in the Quran, which says, obey those who have authority, ulul amr minkum, those who have authority among you. And this is an abstract notion, which was again defined, especially by Ibn Taymiyyah, in his book Sharia-based Siyasa or Politics. He said, this verse asks Muslims to obey ulama and umara, basically ulama and umara, state authority. And since that time today, this ulema-state alliance, which emerged 11th and 12th centuries, established a financial basis with the Iqta system and more recently oil rentier economies, an ideological and theological basis, as I said, fabricating hadith and interpreting Quranic verses, and of course, political power. And their power was mostly follow this ideological, economic, and political basis. And in political science terminology, I call it a critical juncture, where agents and structure were both ready for change, and it created a path-dependent legacy. And the result was the marginalization of independent scholars and merchants. And the result was economic and scientific decline. And that was best symbolized in the Ottoman and Safavi empires. The Ottomans institutionalized ulema-state alliance in a very deep manner, whereas Safavis in Iran established a Shia version of ulema-state alliance. Mughal Empire was much more complex because it was Hindu majority, but still certain elements of ulema-state alliance can be visible even there. And that created really a different comparison with Europe, because initially Muslims were cutting edge. They learned paper making from China. 8th century established paper making factories, and Europe waited 400 years to produce paper. But later on, Europe learned again China printing press, established printing presses in Germany and Italy and elsewhere. But Muslims wait about 300 years to adopt this technology. Why? Because among the three elements Europe used, printing press, nautical compass, and gunpowder, Muslims these three empires only pick up gunpowder, because in the decision-making table, there were only ulama and the military commanders, and military understood quickly what gunpowder was for their strategies. And ulama had no position to say no to gunpowder, otherwise they would be killed or oppressed. But for the printing press, there was no capitalist bourgeoisie class, a la Benedict Anderson, print capitalism, or an intellectual class who can understand the importance. So then we have the reversal in literacy rate. We have the reversal in libraries and book numbers. And when it came early 19th century in the Ottoman Empire, estimate literacy rate only 1%, whereas 31% in Western Europe. So, is this narrative or analysis was unknown in the Muslim world? Am I making an original contribution with my book? No, the answer is clearly no, because this analysis was very well known in 19th century Muslim world. Until our modern discourses of labeling people Orientalists, etc., Muslim world was full aware of the problem. And Ottoman Empire, finally, they made the decision that we have to change. The system is not working. They pick up the printing press. They establish European-style institutions. They even abolish Janissaries. They sideline the ulema, not only in Istanbul by the Ottoman Empire, but also Muhammad Ali Pasha in Egypt, Cairo. And the reform movement took about a century, maybe longer. And if you look at early founders of Muslim majority modern states, almost all of them were founded by secularists, at least reformist leaders. Atatürk in Turkey, Shah in Iran, Shah of Afghanistan, Ba'ath regime in Syria and Iraq, Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, secularist leaders in Bangladesh, Indonesia, elsewhere. And when I bring the arguments in my two books, in this Islam book, I said ulema-state alliance, and in the secularism book, I use the concept of ancien regime. How Republicans became assertively secularist and almost against religion in France and Turkey, because they react an ancien regime, which was the marriage of crown and faith, or religious authority and monarchy. Therefore, Republicans became, in both cases, France and Turkey, anti-monarchy and anti-religious establishment, anti-clerical. Whereas in the United States, my third case in my first book, there was no ancien regime. Therefore, the Republicans didn't attack religion. They attacked British crown and British imperialism, but not particularly they became anti-religious. That's what I call passive secularism, religious-friendly secularism emerge in the United States. So now in the Muslim world, until 1970s, there was the secularist trend. So then you can ask me if ulema was the problem. And then for a century, ulema was attacked. Could they solve the problems? Unfortunately, no, they couldn't solve the problems. They had some progress, some literacy, schooling, etc. We cannot complete the trash a century of reform. But I would say the main problem why they were not really successful was that sidelining the ulama was not the only way to have progress. You have to encourage and allow intellectual class and bourgeoisie class. The secularist reformists had more military understanding of world, top-down, centralized. They were very state-centric, from Atatürk to Jamal Abdel Nasser to many other military leaders. They didn't allow the rise of independent bourgeoisie. They didn't allow the rise of merchant class. Therefore, the secularist reformists were not very different from ulema-state alliance. Then eventually, after 1970s, especially 1979 was a crucial year. Iranian Revolution, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan starting the Islamic Jihad, and the seizure of Grand Mosque in Mecca, making Saudi regime even more radical. And then Muslim countries experience Islamization, what I call in the slide the Islamic trend, either as a full legal Islamization in Iran, Sudan, Afghanistan, or a bottom-up like in Egypt, or some new ulema-state allies, even in Turkey, even in other Algeria, Tunisia examples, ulema-state allies in different forms and degrees re-emerge because of the general trend of Islamization. And then problems became deeper with blasphemy laws, with the restrictions over women's rights, etc. So therefore, both trends, secularist trend and Islamic trends, common problems, I summarize here as the limits of participatory politics and equal citizenships, minority rights and other rights. Then the question is what the new trend could be in the Muslim world. In Turkey, in Iran, in Turkey after Erdogan, in Iran if the Islamic revolution turned into a new the transformation, what we will see, we can discuss in the Q&A. But basically what I can summarize, what we have now in the Muslim world, secular states, mixed state and Islamic states. Official religion doesn't exist, of course, in a secular state. It exists in mixed or Islamic one. So basically, constitutionally, Turkey is the secular state, but Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and many others can be put in the category. Mixed state like Tunisia, and Islamic state, of course, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and many Gulf countries. And the role of ulema, as you see in the table, the judicial role exists only in this. Islamic state has both judicial and legislative role of the ulema. Mixed state only accept Islamic courts, not the legislative role, and secular state constitutionally deny all three. And then when we look at this Muslim majority societies, we have 22 secular states today, 11 mixed states, 17 Islamic states, and I make the democracies bold. Burkina Faso, I need to update the table, is no longer democracy. Kosovo, Senegal, Albania, Indonesia, Sierra Leone, and Tunisia is also dropped from the list. So the list is getting smaller, and both the Islamic and secular categories have problems with democracy. So in my first book, I analyzed Turkey in comparison to France and United States. And the argument was that assertive secularism, French laïcité, they call laïcité de combat, combative secularism. It's dominant in some countries like Mexico, which also transformed after 1992. Turkey, which is no longer assertive secular today, it's a populist Islamist regime. And Tunisia, it's also transformed. But by the time I wrote the book, 2009, all of them by and large could be defined as assertive secularists, which means state is supposed to play an assertive role to exclude religion from public sphere and create a secular public domain. That's the ideological utopia, although in practice, even in the Soviet Union, they couldn't really completely cleanse religion from public life. That's where ideology referring to an utopia. And the passive secular utopia in the United States, Netherlands, you can add many other European democracies, where state is supposed to play a passive role to tolerate public visibility of religious or secular symbols and ways of lives. And the historical origin, as I said, of this assertive type is the ancien regime. If the republic emerged in reaction and fighting against crown and the religious establishment, it became assertive state. The absence of the elements of ancien regime led the possibility of passive secularism. So when my book was translated into Turkish and Arabic, one of my friends said to change the even title. They say the term al-ma'niya, as Hussam knows, is a pejorative term. People will not read it. But in fact, it was a time of the Arab uprisings. The translation was very well received. And we have the book review and sharing platform, Goodreads.com. And Goodreads.com put the Arabic version of my book as the primary version and eliminate the English one. I said, why did you do that? They said, because there are more Arabic reviews than the English. So there was some reception from Arab leaders, especially two types of Almania. Almania Hazma, Almania Salbiya, passive secularism, assertive secularism. But the main critique I received was, especially in Turkey, I had a very hard time to convince Turkish friends. They say, Ahmet, you don't know Islam. I say, I studied Islam for a long time. How couldn't I know that? They say, no, Islam is very dangerous. Islam never allows passive secularism. America is different because America doesn't have Islam. So I wrote a whole book to analyze Islam. And then try to show that, yes, ulama have deep judicial and legislative roots, but ulama's standing is also very fragile. So now let me conclude by the discussion between the two books, that both take history seriously in terms of theory, both takes ideas seriously. Although material factors are important, ideas really shape certain political trends. And in terms of methodology, we see in both books critical junctures, path dependence, and the role of agents and structure. And the policy recommendation in both cases is that there need to be a certain level of separation between religion and state in Muslim societies. So then the challenge to the first book was, as I said, that it's not United States, Christianity, you always have separation of church and state. In Islam, you never have that. Therefore, your proposal of passive secularism would never work in Muslim societies. But when I analyze Islam and Muslim societies in the new book, I find out that the ulama's establishment and political standing and partnership with the state is very vulnerable because historically, as I said, between 7th and 12th centuries, there was very long period of certain degree of separation for various reasons we can discuss. Plus, theoretically, ulama only exist in Shia Islam. In Shia Islam, since they accept after Prophet Muhammad the existence of some holy people, 7 imam or 12 imams, clergy has a legitimacy. In Sunni Islam, clergy does not have existence and legitimacy because there is no difference between laymen and clergy in Sunni Islam. And ulama know that in Arabic, when we discuss and challenge them, are you ruhban? Ruhban basically means a spiritual class. They say, no, there is no ruhban in Islam. There is no clergy in Islam. Then who are you? And when it comes to take responsibility, they never accept responsibility. Ulama always say that we are equal. There's no difference between us. We are not a separate clergy like the Catholic Church. But when people like myself try to say something about Islam, they say, no, you are not ulama. You cannot talk about Islam. This double discourse worked for about 1,000 years. I think it's time to put ulama under the spot and ask them to take responsibility what they have done so far. And it's very wrong to always blame the state. State is a problem, military state especially. But if we keep talking about state, we ignore the ulama problem. And the alliance between the two has no Quranic or Hadith legitimacy. That's why they are fabricating Hadith and reinterpreting Quranic verses. So that's the summary of my work. And thanks for listening. And I will be happy to answer if there are any questions.